On the frost-bitten morning of February 3rd, 1883, in the township of Witherby Hollow, Massachusetts, nestled quietly in the foothills of the Berkshire Mountains, a housemaid named Elsie Penwright made her routine climb up the wide spiral staircase of Witherby Hall, balancing a tray of warm rosewater and bread biscuits for the lady of the house, only to find her employer, Evelyn Hargrave, the 29-year-old widow of the late iron magnate Silas Hargrave, seated rigidly in her armchair, her eyes open and bloodshot, lips parted in a frozen gasp, a silver fountain pen still clutched in her right hand, and a small leather notebook stained with ink and blood resting on her lap. This discovery would become the spark that ignited a scandal so dangerous, so far-reaching, that local lawmen, state officials, and even federal investigators would do everything in their power to suppress it for the next 141 years, until an anonymous descendant leaked the long-sealed journal pages online, blowing the lid off what would later be known as the Witherby Conspiracy. But on that frigid morning in 1883, Elsie could only scream as she dropped the breakfast tray and ran for help, unaware that Evelyn's final entry, hastily scrawled in the margins of her journal, contained 23 names of prominent businessmen, clerics, and civil officials, next to a column of dates and amounts, beside short phrases like forced transfer, shipment routed to Ashford, and W shipping manifest falsified, all of which would make sense only in hindsight, for at the time of Evelyn's death, her life was seen as one of mourning and withdrawal after the untimely passing of her husband 9 months prior, Silas Hargrave, a man of immense wealth and cruel reputation, whose mysterious drowning in his own estate's koi pond on the night of his 44th birthday was declared a tragic accident, even though the pond was only 18 inches deep and Silas was a known swimmer, an avid diver in his youth, and whose own brother, Judge Wendell Hargrave, signed the death certificate without an inquest. But Evelyn, ever composed and polite at public appearances, had reportedly become obsessed with her husband's ledgers and business records in the months following his death, disappearing for days into the library, asking obscure questions about shipping routes and requesting books on metallurgy and rail construction, subjects no high-born widow in polite society would typically bother with. And while townsfolk whispered that grief had unhinged her, the truth lay buried behind the red velvet curtains of Witherby Hall, where Evelyn had apparently unearthed something she was never meant to find, a pattern of falsified financial statements tied to a secretive consortium known only in coded correspondence as the Iron Vein, whose members appeared to be funneling forged war bonds, slave labor contracts, and experimental weapons parts through Witherby's shipping docks under the guise of mining equipment. Evelyn's final 3 journal entries, which were kept hidden by Reverend Augustus Monroe of St. Lucia's Parish until his death in 1901, revealed in their unedited form that she had made plans to deliver the ledger to a Boston reporter named Calvin Rusk, who was rumored to have been courting her after Silas's death and had himself disappeared 2 days after Evelyn's funeral, last seen boarding the 7:12 train to Springfield, carrying a brown satchel and looking over his shoulder with visible dread. But on the morning of her death, no one noticed the broken glass under Evelyn's desk, the smudged boot prints leading from the study's French doors, or the faint odor of pipe tobacco that none of the house staff smoked, least of all the town sheriff, Clark Dobbins, who arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, but whose report listed Evelyn's cause of death as pulmonary hysteria brought on by excessive emotional strain, even though Dr. Gilead Morris, the attending physician who briefly examined her before being dismissed, later told a colleague in a confidential letter dated February 5, 1883, that her lungs bore signs of chemical burns consistent with arsenical gas, not natural causes, and that her fingers had deep ink scratches consistent with writing under duress. That letter, found hidden in the lining of a violin case owned by the Morris family and now on display at the Witherby Historical Museum, also mentioned that her journal did not contain mere household accounts, but blueprints, shipping codes, and what appears to be a cipher key in Latin and Greek, leading modern historians to believe that Evelyn had not only uncovered a criminal operation, but had begun decrypting its communications. Indeed, her journal's final page ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if interrupted. "If anything should happen to me, the proof lies not in the vault, but in the rosewood frame beneath Silas's, before a large ink blot obscures the rest," suggesting either a hurried end or a deliberate smear. But either way, the journal was seized by Judge Wendell Hargrave himself, citing matters of family dignity, and it would not be seen again publicly until 2024, when a relative of Elsie Penright contacted a historical podcast with scanned copies from a sealed trunk in the attic of an ancestral home, sparking renewed interest and public outcry. Yet at the time, in 1883, no one in Witherby dared question the official story, and Evelyn was buried beside Silas in the Hargrave mausoleum under a headstone that read simply, "Beloved wife and faithful widow." Though many who knew her remembered her as fiercely intelligent, strangely secretive in her last months, and reportedly troubled by dreams, she confided to her May dreams in which a faceless man in iron shackles would emerge from the koi pond and whisper, "The dead must speak," while crows gathered on the windowsill. These chilling visions, written down in Elsie's personal prayer diary, now authenticated by archivists, add yet another eerie layer to the story, suggesting Evelyn may have anticipated her own murder and perhaps even left clues hidden within. The manner clues that investigators would only begin to uncover 140 years later, when a group of urban explorers broke into the abandoned east wing of Witherby Hall and discovered behind a false wall in the study's bookcase a rusted iron box containing a rolled-up schematic of underground tunnels running from the estate cellar to the old iron foundry across town, complete with notes in Evelyn's handwriting. Night transfers begin here, silent carts, no ledgers past 1881, which appeared to corroborate the long-dismissed claims of Witherby's late lamplighter George Wick, who, in his 1891 asylum deposition, had said he saw men hauling heavy trunks in silence beneath the moonlight, disappearing beneath the manor like ghosts, and had been promptly labeled a lunatic after writing the names of 7 prominent Witherby businessmen in his own feces on the asylum wall, a grotesque but telling indicator of the depths to which the truth had been buried, silenced by status, power, and fear. For at the heart of Evelyn Hargrave's tragic death was not merely a domestic accident or emotional collapse, but the deliberate erasure of a woman who had stumbled upon a truth that threatened to unravel the social, political, and economic foundation of her time, a secret written in ink and blood and smuggled into history not through courts or archives, but through whispers, journals, and dreams. The rest, as they say, was left to be uncovered by the living. When the grainy photographs of Evelyn Hargrave's decrypted journal pages first surfaced on the dark corners of Reddit in December 2024, shared by a user named EpenWright141, most dismissed them as part of an elaborate historical fiction project until a retired MIT cryptographer named Howard Levens reached out to the poster and verified that the cipher markings in the margins matched those used by Union intelligence operatives during the Reconstruction era, and that the journal's Latin phrases, once properly translated and aligned, revealed coordinates, ledger entries, and references to long-buried congressional hearings about military surplus shipments misallocated for domestic experimental projects, sending the amateur sleuthing community into a frenzy and prompting an independent investigative team from the Kinvis, Massachusetts Historical Crimes Unit, MHCU, led by former forensic archaeologist turned detective Mara Ellison, to obtain a warrant for excavation rights at Witherby Hall, a decrepit and half-collapsed mansion now owned by the state under historical preservation limbo. Its eastern wing, overtaken by vines, its floorboards warped by decades of snowmelt and rot, and its interior thick with the scent of mildew, rust, and forgotten tragedy. And when Ellison's team descended into the cobweb-choked cellar beneath the Hargrave estate, accompanied by structural engineers and 2 nervous anthropology grad students from UMass Amherst, they found not only the schematic tunnels Evelyn had mapped, but several sealed wooden crates, metal skeletons of old wheelbarrows, and a rusted cart track that wound its way into a sunken archway beneath the Kelly foundation, an archway carved with symbols later confirmed to be the emblems of Hargrave Mining and Eastern Iron Transit Co., both defunct since the 1890s. But what caused the real firestorm was what they found deeper in the tunnel, past a small iron door that had been hastily reinforced with beams from within, a room no larger than a stable stall, lined with rotted shells and 4 burlap sacks, labeled WHEXP 1080 seconds, which contained what appeared to be partially melted and blackened human bone fragments, shards of mercury glass, and dozens of tiny lead pellets, as well as what remained of a child-sized metal restraint device that experts claimed was not built for horses or mules, leading to speculation that human experimentation had occurred beneath Witherby Hall as part of a rogue weapons testing program that predated government acknowledgement by at least 2 decades. And amid this chaos, Ellison herself discovered, tucked behind a false panel in the back of a rusted filing cabinet, a brittle envelope addressed to C. Rusk, Do Not Trust Wind, dated January 27, 1883, in Evelyn's unmistakable script. Inside which were 3 things: a blood-stained handkerchief, a coded list of inventory items with quantities and serials marked in red, and a short note reading, "If I vanish, the ledger is not the only proof. Find the second key hidden. Where winter first thawed our vows," a phrase that haunted Ellison, who then dove into historical wedding records and discovered that Evelyn and Silas had been married on March 3, 1874, in the Rose Conservatory of the Hargrave estate, a wing that had been destroyed in the Great Fire of 1898, but according to floor plans had once housed a marble statue of Persephone and a frozen lily fountain, the latter of which, after some careful excavation, was found still intact beneath the rubble, and beneath its cracked marble base, encased in wax and sealed. In an oilcloth pouch was a second journal far smaller than the first but even more damning, containing not only maps and shipments routed from Hargrave Holdings to private buyers in the Caribbean and Eastern Europe, but also explicit references to a now extinct organization called Thistleworks, believed by modern researchers to have been a front for smuggling chemical agents and conducting resilience tests on prisoners, indigents, and allegedly even orphans under the guise of tuberculosis quarantine treatment, linking Hargrave's Iron Empire not only to war profiteering, but to a covert system of human trafficking and experimental death camps, whose very mention in academic circles had been labeled speculative conspiracy until now. And as the media caught wind of these findings, Witherby Hollow erupted into the national spotlight, prompting local descendants of the original families to lawyer up, discredit the findings, or flee altogether, including a sitting U.S. senator, who abruptly resigned after his familial ties to Wendell Hargrave were revealed through court-subpoenaed genealogical records. But for Ellison, the most haunting moment came not from press conferences or evidence boards, but from a late-night call from a local librarian named Anna Melise, who claimed her great-aunt had left her a box of items meant for the next to chase Evelyn's truth. And among those items delivered in a rain-warped cigar box was a black-and-white daguerreotype of Evelyn Hargrave seated in the study, flanked not by books but by 3 children, none of whom bore any resemblance to Silas and whose existence had never been recorded in family trees or town registries, suggesting Evelyn had either adopted or concealed them for their own protection. But more chilling was the image's back, where Evelyn had scribbled in quill ink, "Only those born of chains can see the links we ignore," a line which would later be traced to a rare abolitionist sermon printed in 1865 by Reverend Clark Monroe, yes, the same Reverend Augustus Monroe from Evelyn's funeral, whose name had simply changed spelling over time, and who, it turned out, had once been excommunicated from his original parish in Virginia for congregational agitation and sedition, and had been relocated to Witherby as part of a state-sponsored clerical reassignment, which in hindsight appeared less like redemption and more like containment. And as Ellison's team continued to dig, literal and metaphorical bones began surfacing across the town. School ledgers from the 1880s showed the sudden closure of Witherby's orphanage with no relocation records. Shipping documents revealed discrepancies in the cargo weight of Silas Hargrave's last 3 railway shipments, and Evelyn's journal referenced a cabin in the Pines where she met a man known only as possibly George Wick, the mad lamplighter whose ravings now read more like first-hand accounts, especially after a local metal detectorist found a rusted oil lamp engraved with G.W. buried near the remains of what used to be a shack 2 miles east of Witherby, inside which investigators uncovered burnt floorboards, scorched iron rings, and a broken pipe bearing military stamps from a foundry in Ohio used during experimental steam harnessing trials in the early 1880s. All of this pointed to the impossible truth that Evelyn Hargrave had not only uncovered a criminal conspiracy, but had tried desperately to document and preserve it for future generations, embedding clues in her letters, her home, her relationships, even her grave, which, when exhumed in early 2025 under special state order, revealed that her casket had been tampered with post-burial and lined with a second, thinner layer of wood etched with Latin verses from the Book of Revelations verses, specifically describing the fall of Babylon and the punishment of those who trafficked in the souls of men. And with this discovery, public outcry swelled. Historians demanded open access to the Hargrave estate, and a full criminal review was launched against the descendants of those implicated, some of whom had shared key positions in state infrastructure, military procurement, and pharmaceutical. Boards revealing a vast generational web of inherited silence, enforced power, and vanishing evidence. And as Ellison stood on the frost-covered grounds of Witherby Hall with snow falling gently onto the disturbed soil, she found herself haunted by Evelyn's final message. Let no name stand unmarked, no secret rot in peace. A vow she scribbled in her notebook as the wind blew open the aged oak doors of the estate behind her, doors that hadn't opened in over a century, and in the silence that followed, the sound of faint tapping could be heard, not from within the tunnels below, but from the study fireplace above, where a single crow feather floated downward through the chimney shaft and landed beside a small, charred envelope addressed to the one who listens, and that was when Mara Ellison realized Evelyn Hargrave's voice had never stopped speaking. It had simply waited to be heard. By the time the Senate Oversight Committee convened a closed or emergency session in March 2025, the name Evelyn Hargrave was no longer just a footnote in dusty local records. It had become a national reckoning, a symbol of how deeply the roots of corruption, exploitation, and cover-up could bury themselves beneath generations of civic pride and family legacy. And as headlines screamed phrases like the widow's truth and the iron vein lives, Mara Ellison stood at the eye of the storm, not as a mere investigator, but as the woman who had finally followed Evelyn's ink-stained trail to its horrifying end, one that did not lie in the walls of Witherby Hall or even beneath it, but in a place far colder, cleaner, and more brutal, an abandoned military research facility 50 miles north of town called Camp Ashridge, decommissioned in 1902, sealed off by the federal government, and erased from nearly every map, but still traceable through the shipment. Manifests Evelyn had painstakingly copied from Silas's ledgers, pointing to a final destination marked only as a 9-cold parcel. Armed with newly declassified transit records and a warrant obtained through the DOJ's Historical Crime Unit, Ellison and a federal team descended into Ashridge's frost-bitten bunkers, where they found vaults filled with half-decayed crates, stamped with the same WHEXP codes from Evelyn's journals, containing everything from gas masks with child-sized head straps to surgical tools tagged in French and German, all shockingly preserved under layers of waxed linen, along with hundreds of medical records listing names, weights, ages, and test results, beside shorthand notes like STG4 tolerances exceeded, or pupil rupture confirmed, notes Ellison could barely bring herself to read aloud. But it wasn't just physical evidence they uncovered. It was the implications, a transatlantic human experimentation network that had originated with the Hargrave-led iron vein and been passed like a rotting heirloom into the vaults of early U.S. biowarfare testing programs, hidden by euphemisms like resilience metrics and infective adaptability, all of which had remained legally protected under layers of wartime secrecy until Evelyn, in her grief and brilliance, had begun peeling them apart one ledger at a time, a task that had cost her everything and left her legacy to rot for over a century. But the most devastating twist came not from records or artifacts, but from blood, the blood of Evelyn Hargrave herself, which forensic genealogists, in collaboration with Ellison's team, compared to that of 3 known descendants from Witherby Hollow who had volunteered DNA samples for historical research, and found a direct match not with the Hargrave line, but with a woman named Lucy Elkins, the adopted great-granddaughter of Evelyn's housemaid Elsie Penwright. revealing that Evelyn had faked the burial of at least one of her biological children under another name, shielding the lineage through servants to escape the Iron Vein's reach, and that the truth of her family had endured not through wealth or name, but through quiet resistance, handwritten diaries, and a fierce sense of duty inherited unknowingly by generations. And when confronted with this revelation, Lucy, a librarian in her late 40s with no interest in politics, wept as she held the same handkerchief Evelyn had once tucked into a coded letter, realizing she was the descendant of a woman history had tried to erase and failed, because truth, once planted deeply enough, has a way of cracking through stone. Meanwhile, across the country, the fallout rippled through the descendants of those named in the journal, resignations, suicides, leaked recordings, and sealed court documents now unsealed by mounting public pressure, including an 1890 affidavit from Judge Wendell Hargrave confessing that Evelyn had been persuaded into calmness with vapor sedatives shortly before her death, and that her silence was purchased in service of national interests, an admission tantamount to sanctioned murder, yet buried for over a century beneath bureaucratic code. This revelation incensed the public, but nothing shook the nation more than the final vault-a-cold, soundproofed chamber beneath Ashridge labeled R, which federal agents cracked open with hydraulic tools to reveal a perfectly preserved safe room containing hundreds of reels of 35mm film, marked with dates and experiment numbers, and when digitized and reviewed, confirmed the unthinkable, grainy footage of children, immigrants, and prisoners undergoing exposure trials to airborne agents, all of which predated known biowarfare testing by at least 50 years, implicating early American infrastructure, several pharmaceutical predecessors, and 3 Ivy League institutions that had allegedly provided academic cover for cognitive endurance stressors, creating a scandal of such magnitude that Congress was forced to hold public hearings, and it was in these hearings, live-streamed to millions, that Mara Ellison, seated before a semicircle of grim lawmakers, read aloud the final letter Evelyn Hargrave had written, the one found folded behind the Persephone statue beneath the lily fountain, addressed not to her children or any government, but to the woman who will one day understand. And in it, Evelyn wrote, "You will be tempted to call me mad. You will see only ghosts and ink and old rot. But if you listen to the silence beneath the earth and follow where the paper curls, you will hear them all whispering, those who could not survive to speak. Give them breath. Please, give them breath." And those words, spoken live, ignited protests, truth campaigns, and international calls for reparations for the unnamed and lost victims of Witherby Hollow, leading to what would become known as the Hargrave Tribunal, an unprecedented effort to classify forgotten historical crimes under modern human rights law. With Evelyn Hargrave posthumously declared a federal whistleblower, her journals archived and published, and her grave exhumed and reburied at the National Women's History Memorial in Washington, D.C., beside pioneers like Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Wells, a gesture symbolically restoring her place in a history that had tried to exile her. But for Mara Ellison, justice did not end in tribunals or graves, for she had discovered, in the margins of Evelyn's last journal, a final cipher that she alone understood, one referencing dates not of shipments, but of deaths, 12 unexplained. Passings in Witherby Hollow between 1882 and 1885. All women, all poor, and all noted in Evelyn's hand with the phrase, "unsuitable witness." And following this clue led Ellison to the town's derelict church basement, where, behind a crumbling brick wall and the scent of mold and sorrow, she found 12 unmarked headstones wrapped in oilcloth, each carved with a flower, each missing from town records, confirming that the iron vein had not only silenced Evelyn, but systematically removed others who had gotten too close. And this discovery, broadcast with tearful clarity by Ellison in a final press conference, finally broke the last wall of resistance in Witherby Hollow. Those who had once defended the town's heritage now offered quiet apologies or packed their homes in shame, while the Witherby Historical Society voted unanimously to rename the estate Hargrave Memorial Grounds for Ethical Inquiry, opening its newly preserved East Wing as an education center dedicated to historical accountability. And as for Ellison, she declined television deals and government posts, choosing instead to remain in Witherby Hollow, where she now teaches investigative history at the local college and keeps Evelyn's final journal in a glass case beside her desk, its cover still marked with dried ink and smudged fingerprints, a testament to the woman who, with no one to trust and nothing but her intellect and courage, had stared into the heart of darkness and written her truth anyway. And every February, on the anniversary of Evelyn's death, Ellison lights a lantern outside Witherby Hall, leaving it by the garden gate where Evelyn's conservatory once stood. And local children gather to hear the story not just of a murder, but of a warning, a rebellion, and a legacy etched in names once forgotten but now recited each year in the town square. Evelyn Hargrave, George Wick, Lucy Elkins, the 12 unknown, and all those who dared to remember.